There was an editorial in the latest Newsweek magazine by George Will that focused in on an interesting phenomena that has become increasingly prevalent in our late 20th century America. I'm going to read just a few excerpts because I would like to use this and another article to sort of set the stage for that upon which we shall focus our attention this morning. Mr. Will's article was entitled "Curdled Politics on Campus," subtitled "Tenured Radicals Are Trying to Turn Campuses into Authoritarian Mini-States." Now, he goes on into the article and he said these tenured radicals, often 1960s retreads, are inverting a 1960s demand. Then students demanded that universities loosen restrictions. Today's radicalism from above uses administrative power to improve or to impose an improved consciousness, quote unquote, on students. It uses various instruments of indoctrination, from mandatory instruction and officially approved thinking about race, gender, sexual preference, things of this sort, to codes of permissible speech. This is done in the name of sensitivity to the needs of diversity. That code word is an umbrella under which radicals cluster to advocate academic spoil systems, racial, ethnic, sexual, and political curriculums. Goes on a little further, gives an example of the types of things that the lengths to which sensitivity has gone on campus. A Harvard dean recently denounced dining hall employees for having a back to the 50s party. That was labeled as insensitive on their part because, quote, "it is incorrect to feel nostalgic about a decade marred by segregation." Now, that meant that nothing that bespoke of the 50s should be done. Okay. Goes on. It says, it was just another instance of delight in the new liberals' delight in lording it over his supposed moral inferiors. A Harvard professor was forced to cancel the screening of a film because it included a black maid, a crime against sensitivity. This was the result of a new entitlement, the right to be hypersensitive and to hector and to harass and punish people who do or say or show any sign of thinking anything that offends anybody in any officially approved category. Well, a University of California administrator wants to stamp out such familiar phrases as a chink in his armor or a nip in the air because there could, in certain contexts, be an ethnic connotation to those phrases, which have no connotation whatsoever used in that context. But anyway, he felt that was insensitive to use those terms. When someone does, another university prohibits, quote, "inappropriately directed laughter and conspicuous exclusion of others from conversations." Well, that gives you a little bit of the gist of what he's talking about. Another article back several months ago in early March, this was from U.S. News and World Report, an article by John Leo on the political taboos of the 90s. And as part of its rigorous campaign against political incorrectness, Smith College warns its fresh people — they don't have freshmen because that's insensitive, you see, fresh people, about various isms that affect campus life. Now, there are actually 21 isms listed here in John Leo's article. Starts out with racism, sexism, heterosexism. Heterosexism, of course, means a preference for someone of the opposite sex as opposed to well, here's the list. That's not even the good part. See, it's one of the isms, ableism. Have you ever heard of ableism? That is bias against the physically challenged and differently abled. They were formerly called disabled or handicapped, but that's an insensitive term. So they, instead of handicapped, they are to be termed the differently abled. Bias against them by the, quote, temporarily abled is called ableism. The phrase blind to the truth would be an example of ableist language. Stairs would be an example of ableist architecture. Another ism to be avoided, homism. The oppression of the homeless by the non-vagrant homed, or the temporarily homed. Some anti-homists now favor the term houseless. A Long Island teacher recently instructed some street people, you're not homeless, you're houseless, not homeless, because home is wherever you are. Okay, another ism, sightism. I'm not going to give you all the isms, I'm just going to pick out a couple. Sightism, the belief that visually impaired people cannot do as well as sighted people at all tasks. The Federal Aviation Administration, for example, refused to allow blind people to sit in emergency exit rows on airplanes. This was sightist. Because they couldn't see the exit sign, see? So they couldn't see the exit sign to get off in case they had an emergency. But that was... here's one that I like. Lookism. The belief that some people are easier on the eyes than others. This creates an unacceptable hierarchy based on mere appearances. Sizeism. Prejudice against the differently sized. Articles on dieting and overeating are biased and impede growth of the size acceptance movement. Size acceptance activist Sally E. Smith argues that articles on liposuction and are sizistic examples of, quote, one of the last safe prejudices in America. Laughism, inappropriately directed laughter. This has been banned, by the way, at the University of Connecticut. Conversational exclusionism, conspicuous banning of persons from private chats. In other words, you're talking to somebody and you don't want a third person walks up and you stop. I mean, the two of you are carrying on a private conversation or something. Well, conspicuous banning of persons from private chats also violates the sensitivity maintenance rules at the University of Connecticut. Now, verbal sexism. This is a major one. In fact, they had a real problem out in San Francisco concerning manhole covers because it created a stir that this was blatantly sexist. This was totally insensitive to have something called a manhole cover. So the San Francisco Board of Supervisors actually sponsored a contest to rename manhole covers. They had to come up with a new name. They had a variety of things. Some didn't take the contest seriously and suggested such names as sewer viewer. That was not that attempt at humor. That would probably come under the classification of laughism, inappropriately directed laughter. They finally decided that they would. They came up with a couple of different things. In Sacramento, they were renamed as person access chambers. San Francisco got a little more elaborate. They were called utility access apertures. In San Francisco, they're not manhole covers anymore. They're utility access apertures. One last one: shaveism, prejudice against the bearded and generally hirsute. Mickey Kaus of the New Republic writes that while growing a beard, he was disinvited by a cable TV show out of, quote, blatant shaveism. The point that I wish to make on some of that, just a few excerpts of it, but the code that runs all through both of these articles, the emphasis or the thing that is there, has to do with the subject of sensitivity. Now, sensitivity has become quite a buzzword, quite a sort of a late 20th century fad. And in reality, what parades as sensitivity and what is identified in some of these contexts as sensitivity is really nothing but a late 20th century pseudo-substitute for something that is important, and that is love. The misuse and the almost ludicrous application and distortion of the term sensitivity is used increasingly as really a pseudo-substitute for love. Jesus said to his disciples in John chapter 13 and verse 34, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another." Now Jesus Christ emphasized love. The Bible emphasizes love, the importance of loving one another, of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. Christ emphasized here to his disciples that we are to love one another in the way that he loved us. The almost ludicrous examples that some of the politically correct thinking of the last few years has gone to promote what is termed sensitivity is not what real love is all about. There is far, far more to love than the sort of hypersensitivity, being bent out of shape, wearing feelings on the end of the coat sleeves to where anything that anybody says is going to be scrutinized for the most minor and petty sort of infraction. We focused last week on a scripture in the book of Ephesians in chapter 4, where we were told to walk worthy of the vocation wherewith we're called, in Ephesians 4:1, with all lowliness and meekness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And we went through that sevenfold unity that is outlined here by the Apostle Paul. A unity that is to characterize the people of God. A unity that is to characterize the church of God. That ultimately, the basis of our unity is a unity of the Spirit. And as we focus in, as we approach the day of Pentecost, we focus in specifically on things relevant to that and pertaining to that, understanding that the day of Pentecost is the day that celebrates the establishment of God's covenant with His covenant people. The new covenant, of course, is in the process of being made. It is still a present progressive. The new covenant will not be completed until Christ returns, because it involves the writing of the law of God in our hearts and in our minds, and that is something that is in process right now through the power of God's Spirit. God's law is not perfectly and totally, completely inscribed in your heart or mine right now. But God is in the process of writing it there through His Spirit, which again, the day of Pentecost celebrates. The establishment, the making of the covenant, it celebrates the giving of the Holy Spirit. It is a day that focuses in on the church and its purpose and what makes the church the unique body that it is. Because we're told here about the unity of the Spirit, but it is with lowliness, with meekness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love, keeping the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Love is at the basis of our relationship with one another. God's Spirit makes possible that love. It makes possible that basis, and God's Spirit is the basis of true unity, and we focused on the different aspects of it. But this Sabbath, I would like to focus in on specifically the issue of love. That characteristic which Jesus Christ said is to characterize His disciples. That is to be a hallmark of His true people. And real love, the love that is defined in the Scriptures, is not to be confused with the substitutes, with the fads, with the various ideas and attitudes of people that come and go. It is not to be confused with something that really stops far short of what is real love. We should never settle for a substitute for a secular substitute for what is to be the reality of the love of God shed abroad in our hearts by the power of the Holy Spirit, directed out toward others. The Apostle Paul laid great emphasis on love and an explanation of what love is in 1 Corinthians 13. He said, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity." The Greek word agape. It means love. The word charity is used here in an older English sense. When we think of charity, we think of donating used clothes to the Salvation Army or something of that sort. And the word here means far more. The word charity used in the Old English sense was a much broader word than our modern use of the term. It meant really love in action. Love that is not simply a feeling or an emotion, but an attitude of life that is reflected in our conduct. That was the meaning of charity at the time the King James translation was made, a much broader meaning than what the word has for us today. Love is a better, more modern English sense, though again, even the word love is so misused. You know, virtually every song is about love, or purports to be about love, but when you really listen to what the words are, it's about anything but love. It's usually about lust. It's about selfishness. It's about all sorts of things that parade and masquerade under the name love. But the word that is used here in the Greek language, agape, that is translated charity in the King James translation, that word in the way that it was used almost 400 years ago was a very good rendering of agape, because it had to do with an attitude of love displayed in our actions and in our conduct. Charity was a broader term. And so Paul says, if I have not charity, if I have not love, I have not agape, I have not this attitude that will be displayed in my conduct, in my relationship, in the things that I do to and for and with other people. If I have not this love, this real love, godly love, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, and have not love, charity, this real attitude of love and concern that reflects itself in what we do, I'm nothing. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not love, it profits me nothing. In other words, you can do even the right things for the wrong reasons and it doesn't count. What really counts in the long run, what God is most interested in, is our motives. There are times people do the right thing, but they do it for totally the wrong reason. Now, it may be better than doing the wrong thing, but in terms of the spiritual aspect of it, it is not something that is going to make the difference. He goes on in verse 4, and he begins to describe the characteristics. And I want us to note, sort of one by one, the characteristics, and to see that the real love, the attitude of love that is carried into action in our lives, an attitude of caring and of concern that is put into action, that is reflected in our conduct. This sort of love, godly love, is far more and quite different than the sort of hypersensitivity political fad-ism. We have another ism. It is a love. Love suffers long and is kind. Charity envies not. Charity vaunts not itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeks not her own, is not easily provoked, thinks no evil, rejoices not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Charity never fails. Now let's go through these. Let's sort of go through step by step First thing we're told is that love suffers long, or love is patient, is the way that most of the more modern translations render it. Love is patient. Now, as we go through step by step, let's understand that this is a description of the way that we're to live our lives. This is the way we're to interact with other people. When Jesus said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another," this is the way of life that ought to reflect us in the way that we deal with one another. It ought to reflect the way we deal in our family, with our husband, our wife, our children. It ought to reflect the way that we deal and interact with our neighbor, because we're to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And we are to love one another with a sacrificial love, the love that Christ had. What does that love entail? Is it simply a warm feeling in your heart? You know, we're warned over and over in the Scriptures, and particularly in connection with the last days. Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, a time that would come when many would be offended and would betray one another and hate one another. Christ warned of a time when there would come a sensitivity, perhaps even a hypersensitivity on the part of some, that would lead into ready offense, resentment, and ultimately turn into hatred, the very opposite of love. He warned about a potential division that could come in and separate the very people of God. The very people that ought to be characterized by a unity of the Spirit. Yet, why did Jesus give that warning in Matthew 24? It's something that applies. It's something that is important for all of us to take note of. What are the characteristics here? As we start going through them, let's put a personal perspective on it. Let's evaluate ourselves from the standpoint of how do we deal with our mate? How do we deal with other people? Are we patient? That's one of the characteristics. First characteristic of love is the matter of patience. There are many examples that we could go to in the Scriptures about that. In 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, we find a little bit about the patience of God. God is love. God loves us. God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. Now in 2 Peter 3:9, we're told the Lord is not slack. He's not careless. He's not lax concerning His promise, as some men count slackness, but He is long-suffering. The same word is translated long-suffering there in 1 Corinthians 13. He is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. You know, God gives us a chance to change. The warnings that He gives in the Scripture and the things that are going to come are going to happen. God's not slack concerning His promise, but He's not just standing there ready to pounce. God gives us a chance to change. God is patient. He is long-suffering. He does not have an attitude. You know, if God were impatient, God says, all right, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, get it together, or Zoom, lightning strikes. How many of us would be around? If God weren't patient, if God weren't merciful, how many times have you had to go back to God and ask forgiveness for maybe the same thing? God is patient. It's one of the attributes of love. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 6, interesting statement. Hebrews 6 will start in verse 13. When God made promise to Abraham, because He could swear by no greater, He swore by Himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, after Abraham had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Abraham had to be patient. He had to be patient in terms of God and God's promises. Now we're told that Abraham, in the book of James and other places, we're told that Abraham was the friend of God. Abraham is described as God's friend. Abraham loved God. Not only did God love Abraham, Abraham loved God. And God made a promise to Abraham, and Abraham was an example of patience. He patiently waited for God to do what He said. He didn't become impatient with God and say, well, if you're not going to do what I want you to do when I want you to do it, forget it. I'm going back to Ur of the Chaldees. You see, if we have that kind of love, if we love God as Abraham loved God, then we're prepared to wait on God and not to have an attitude of impatience, a demanding attitude that God do what we want Him to do whenever we want Him to do it. That's not an attitude, that's a demanding sort of an attitude, and is not a reflection of real love. Real love is reflected in patience. You know, Jacob loved Rachel. This is an example, of course, of love in the romantic sense, the love that a husband should have for his wife or vice versa. Now, we're told in Genesis chapter 29 and verse 20, where in verse 18, Jacob loved Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said to Laban, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, it's better I give her to you than give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. Now, Jacob was an example of patience. How many people are willing to wait 7 years? Jacob was willing to work for just simply room and board for 7 years. And actually, it turned out, as you remember the story, he got rooked on the deal. He turned out to work 14 years. He was planning on being patient, but he really didn't have in mind to be that patient. But God allowed him to be sort of put to the test. But you know, think how Rachel must have felt in terms of appreciating the love that her husband had for her, realizing that he was willing, that she was so special and so important to him, that he was willing to work even 14 years, if it was necessary, in order to have her as his wife. And that love is patient. Love does not have this impatient, I want what I want it right now, I'm not going to wait 5 minutes for anything. Love is patient. The kind of love that is described in 1 Corinthians 13, the kind of love that is to be a hallmark of God's people, love is patient. We're also told that love is kind. It's kind. Now, the word for kind here is a word that really has to do with with making something easy. That is the sense. And of course, that's really what kindness does. Kindness sort of eases life. If someone does a kindness to you, they make things easier for you. But to give you a sense of how this word is used, another way the word is translated, it's rendered kind here in 1 Corinthians 13, which is certainly correct, but the word is also used back in Matthew 11, verse 30. Matthew 11, verse 30, we'll pick it up in verse 28. Jesus said, Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The word that is translated kind in 1 Corinthians 13 is rendered easy here in verse 30. My yoke is easy. My yoke is kind. When we are kind to someone, we are seeking to ease their life. We're seeking to make it easy. Love desires to be kind. Love has a desire to be kind, to extend an easing of someone else's burden. Now, that doesn't mean that, well, let's go back to the book of Galatians and let's notice an important distinction to understand here. Galatians chapter 6, we'll notice verses 2 through 4, or 2 and 4. Galatians 6:2 says, "Bear you one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Now, Christ said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest." My burden is easy. So, we're to bear one another's burdens. That means certainly to ease the burden. The word that is used here in the Greek language is a word that simply means burden, means heavy load. Now, I call your attention because verse 5 says, "Every man shall bear his own burden." Now, some have thought this was a contradiction. Verse 2 says, "Bear you one another's burdens," and verse 5 says, "Every man shall bear his own burden." There's an important distinction here. And it's an important distinction to understand in terms of kindness and in terms of love. To bear one another's burdens, to ease the heavy load of one another, that's kindness. That's love. But there's also the recognition in verse 5 that everyone must bear his own burden. Now, the word that's used here for burden is a totally different word that's used in verse 2. The word in verse 2 is baros, which means heavy load. The word in verse 5 is fortion, which means task or service. It's one thing to help bear someone's heavy load. It's another thing to take their responsibilities for them. To take their task, their service, their responsibilities. We all must bear our own task, our own responsibility. We all must be responsible in the proper and appropriate sense. We don't show kindness by getting in and doing for others what they really should be doing for themselves. What is their task, their responsibility. But to help them bear the heavy load, to help them carry the load, to extend kindness is very important. Let's notice an example in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 7. King David is instructing Solomon, his son. In 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 7, David says to Solomon, "Show kindness unto the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be of those that eat at your table. For so they came unto me when I fled because of Absalom your brother." So David instructed Solomon. He said, show kindness to the sons of Barzillai. Show kindness to his family. Now, why was David singling this man out? He says, I want you to remember this man, and I want you to show kindness to his children, to his family. Well, if you go back a few pages, back to 2 Samuel 17 and verse 27, David was fleeing from Jerusalem. Absalom had taken over as king. And in verse 27 of 2 Kings 17, it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim that Shobi, the son of Nahash of Rabbah of the children of Ammon, and Machir, the son of Amiel of Lodebar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite. They brought beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat and barley and flour and parched corn and beans and lentils and parched pulse and honey and butter and sheep and cheese for David and for the people that were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Now, Barzillai was an example of hospitality, an example of kindness. Even at risk to himself, because you see, David was fleeing from Absalom. Absalom had taken over. And many people thought, well, boy, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to look like that I don't want to do anything to antagonize the new king. The old king's on the run. And so David and those that were with him were hungry and they were tired. They just fled with really the clothes on their back. And Barzillai got together with several others and they brought some things out to them. They extended kindness. One of the last things David told Solomon, he said, I want you to remember that man's family. Now Barzillai, if you go and read the story, Barzillai was 80 years old. He was an elderly man. His children, he was probably undoubtedly a grandfather, maybe even a great-grandfather by this time. So, by the time Solomon took over as king, Barzillai was dead. But he had children and grandchildren left, and David said, I want you to always remember that family and show kindness to them, because when I was down and out, they were kind to me. They did something to ease David's burden. You see, this is an example of bearing one another's burdens, of easing the load. They were kind. Kindness has to do really with love in action. That when it's in our power to extend a kindness to ease someone's load, that we are ready and willing to do so. Also in 1 Corinthians Chapter 13, in 1 Corinthians Chapter 13, we're told that not only is love kind, but love envies not. It's not envious, it's not jealous. You know, a great difference between the attitudes of Saul and Jonathan is one had love, the other didn't. And that certainly showed up in terms of envy and jealousy. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18 and verse 6, it came to pass as they came that when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music. And the women answered one another. They were singing, and in this song, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And immediately Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. He said, they've ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed but thousands. What can they do more but the king? What can he have more but the kingdom? Saul was a very insecure individual, and his insecurity did not decrease when he became king. It simply multiplied, because he never dealt with the roots of his problem. You see, material things and material things don't provide security. A sense of being secure is something that comes from the within, a relationship with the above. It is not something that can totally be derived from the around. Saul had all of the trappings of physical security. How can you be more secure than to be the king? Well, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And Saul came to understand that because he was insecure to begin with, and he stayed that way. In fact, it grew worse. It grew worse as the years went by. Saul was, because he was so insecure, was an extremely jealous individual. Anytime anybody received recognition or popularity, Saul, really, this bothered him. Because Saul felt so threatened by anything good that happened to somebody else, any popularity, any compliment that was paid. David was a great hero. He had slain Goliath. He was a great hero. Saul was jealous and became very envious, very jealous because of David's new popularity. Well, we find that this jealousy, this envy, worked on him. And he was becoming increasingly mentally unbalanced. He was harboring resentments and was just allowing them to sit and fester. And we come on over a couple of chapters, chapter 30, or chapter 20 rather. Verse 31, Saul said to his son Jonathan, as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the ground, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. You know, Saul could not understand Jonathan. Because he told Jonathan, he said, look, don't you realize his popularity is a threat to you? It's a threat to you being established as king after my death. What we need to do is collaborate. He trusts you. Let's you entice him into some place where we can have him slain in a private way, in a way that, doesn't get out and where people don't find out what happened to him. Let's do that. Let's get rid of it. Saul was so consumed by jealousy and envy, he could not understand why Jonathan was not. But Jonathan, we're told, loved David. Jonathan really had a bond of deep friendship and love with David. And Jonathan was not jealous or envious of David's popularity. Now, if anybody had a right to be, you would think Jonathan did. After all, he was the one who was going to be eclipsed. He was the one who was the king's son. He would have been in line to be king. Now, if David succeeded, if David accomplished what Saul seemed to think was going to occur, David would become king and Jonathan wouldn't. So you would think that if anybody had a, quote, right to be jealous and envious, yet where do you read about Jonathan being envious of David and jealous of David? Jonathan was not envious and jealous because Jonathan loved David. Love envies not. Love does not have an attitude of envy and jealousy. Envy and jealousy promote strife. People can be envious of one another. You know, we ought to have the attitude, even in the church, that we're all a part of one body. When one member of the body is honored, the whole body is honored. You know, when one member suffers, the whole body suffers. We ought to have that sort of identification, not a matter of being jealous of one another. Oh, you know, he got something, I should have had it. When we feel those twinges of jealousy and envy, that's not love. That is not the attitude that is prompted by love. That's a self-centered approach. An approach that is the opposite of love. So love is not envious, it's not jealous. It is very distinctly, that distinction is very much highlighted in the difference between Jonathan and Saul and their response to David. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians Chapter 13 once again. We're told that not only is love patient and kind, not jealous, but love vaunts not itself. Now, what does that mean, to vaunt not itself? Well, it is an older English way of saying it's not boastful. Love doesn't brag. Love doesn't brag. It's not boastful. There are various examples that we could point to. We might notice here in the book of Romans, see an example that affected certainly many people that were called to exemplify the way of God, the truth of God, or to be an example to others. In Romans chapter 2, in verse 17, the Apostle Paul says, "Behold, you are called a Jew, and you rest in the law, and you make your boast of God. And you know His will, and you approve the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law. You're confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind, and a light of them that are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which have a form of knowledge and of truth in the law." So we find an attitude that is not an attitude of love for the world, but an attitude that is condescending, that looks down on, that makes a boast of God. An attitude that is not based on the proper relationship with God, but viewing a knowledge of God and a knowledge of God's law something to brag about. That's my claim to fame. That puts me one up on all the rest of you. You rest in the law and make your boast of God. Oh, I know God's will. I approve the things that are more excellent, instructed of the law. Here was an example that the Apostle Paul described here, an example that was not an... God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. So, Though there were those who were making their boast in the law, who viewed their relationship with God, their knowledge of God and the law of God and the Bible, who viewed that as something to brag about. That gave them bragging rights. That was the basis of something to boast about. They made a boast of the law and of the superior relationship and knowledge that they had. Attitude of boastfulness. And the result was that though they boasted about the law, through breaking the law, they dishonored God and actually caused God's name to be brought into reproach. They set a bad example. But they had a boastful, bragging sort of approach. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, in Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 1, it says, "Boast not yourself of tomorrow, for you know not what a day may bring forth. Let another man praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips." See, love is not boastful. Love doesn't brag. Here are those who boasted themselves, well, boy, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. None of us know what tomorrow's going to bring. None of us can say with certainty what we're going to do on the morrow. Let another man praise you, and not your own mouth, a stranger, and not your own lips. See, love does not boast and brag and call attention. One of the things that we find here, you see, love is not self-centered. Because when we're impatient, unkind, envious, bragging and boastful, then our whole world centers around ourselves. It's a self-centered approach to life. Love is not based on trying to call everybody's attention to us and how great we are. Love is a concern toward others. It is the love of God shed abroad in our hearts through the power of the Holy Spirit. It's manifested in the way that we treat others. It's not a matter of simply going through the motions of trying to do certain things. You know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, regardless of what you do, if your motive isn't love, it really doesn't count for anything. Love involves both the attitude and the action. Both the attitude and the action. It's not boastful or bragging. Back in James chapter 4. James chapter 4 and verse 14. Verse 13, it says, "Go to now, you that say tomorrow or today or tomorrow, we're going to go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. What is your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a little time and vanishes away. For you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil." You rejoice in your boastings. An attitude that is based on boasting, on bragging, that is a self-centered attitude. An attitude that focuses on the self and how great the self is. I can do this, I can do that, I'll do so and so, I'll never, nobody's going to do this to me. A boastful attitude of what we can do, when in reality, Jesus said, of myself I can do nothing. Now, if Jesus can say that of myself I can do nothing, if he can do nothing by himself, how much less than nothing can any of us do by ourselves? Because he can certainly do more by himself than I can do by myself. And if he says that of myself I can do nothing, then I guess that of myself I can do less than nothing. I don't know how you get less than nothing, but I think that it's a concept that we need to have. a recognition. Love is not boastful. It's not bragging. It does not vaunt itself. Which just simply means to put the self forward, to thrust forward the self. That's what it means to vaunt the self, to thrust forward the self, to try to grab the limelight, to try to focus all of the attention on self, to grab the spotlight, to brag, to boast. That's not love. 1 Corinthians 13 goes on to tell us that not only does love vaunt not itself, it is not puffed up. It's not puffed up. Some of the more modern translations render that conceited or arrogant. Love is not conceited, or love is not arrogant. Now, puffed up is I think, a very descriptive term, because if you've ever been around the barnyard, and you know what I have reference to. I think I've told this story several times before, but I think it really aptly illustrates the example of a turkey. Now, if you've ever seen an old turkey tom strutting around in the barnyard, you know what puffed up means, because that's literally what they do. They puff up. I remember one time visiting one of the members, and he wanted to take me out and show me his chickens and turkeys that he had, and we walked out there, and as we were standing there watching, as we came up, all of a sudden this old turkey tom looked up, and he saw us. And immediately he inhaled in this big amount of air, and his old chest swelled out, and the skin there under his neck just protruded out, and he really puffed up, just almost doubled in size. It appeared right there before our eyes, kind of fluffed his feathers out, and he began to strut. And he began to really let everyone know that he was the most important thing in the barnyard. It was obvious that he did not want us to confuse him with one of these, merely peon chickens or turkey hens. He wanted us to understand that he was the king of the chicken yard. And he was very impressed with his own importance, and just almost doubled in size. He literally puffed up. And it was so hilarious to stand there and watch him. But the thought that crossed my mind is, number one, how ridiculous this silly turkey looks, strutting around here, trying to impress with his importance. And then the next thought that hit me was, we must look the same way to God sometimes as He looks down. And here we are, little puny human beings, all puffed up and strutting around, and so conceited and so arrogant, and so much trying to impress all the other little puny human beings as to how important we are, that it must look just as ridiculous as God looks down and He sees some of us sort of trying to swell up, double in size and really be important. Really the same thing, and you can see it. It comes out in various of the animal world, the various things. I think God has almost caricatured certain traits of human nature in some of the animals to give us a little bit of insight into how ridiculous certain things look. But love is not puffed up. It does not have a conceited, arrogant approach. In 1 Corinthians Chapter 8, the Apostle Paul writes in verse 1, "Now as touching things offered unto idols, you know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love, charity, edifies." The word here is a play on words in the Greek language, because the word edify means literally to build up. So what he's saying is, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. When something is puffed up, it's just a lot of hot air. All you got to do is take a pin and prick it, and all the air comes out. There's no substance. There's no reality. Love builds up. That's solid. That's substantial. Now, when he says knowledge puffs up, what he's talking about is an attitude of mind where people know something or they learn something, they gain a certain knowledge, and what it does is it makes them conceited, it makes them arrogant. Love builds up. Builds something real. It builds something substantial. See, if any man love God, verse 3, the same is known of him. If any man think that he knows something, he knows nothing, yet as he ought to know. See, the real key is not just a matter of, there are those that Paul described as ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, it's not wrong to learn and to gain knowledge. But knowledge often by itself, unless it is utilized in love, can simply puff up. A person can become conceited, arrogant. It becomes something to show off and to try to impress others. It becomes a means of conceit, of vanity, and not something that is used to build up, to help, to step by step build other people. In the book of Philippians Chapter 2, we find another example here of what Paul is describing. Philippians Chapter 2. In verse 2, he says, "Fulfill you my joy, that you be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but on the things of others. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind." Not a conceited, inflated, puffed up, arrogant state of mind, but in lowliness of mind. In lowliness of mind. Jesus Christ exemplified lowliness of mind. You remember when he washed the disciples' feet there in John 13? He said, "You call me Master and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. You show respect to me and to my office, and that's appropriate." But then he said, "Now, do you know what goes with that?" He said, "If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." A willingness to perform the most lowly and the most humbling task. A task that was normally relegated to the most menial of household servants. Jesus Christ said, look, authority and power in the government of God are not to be confused and confounded with conceit and arrogance, some puffed up sort of an approach, but an attitude of humble service, of lowliness of mind. See, we're told in verse 5, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery, thought it not something to be seized or to be grasped, to be equal with God. But he made of himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of man." He humbled himself. He humbled himself. And became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So, it goes on in verse 9, "Wherefore God has also highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow." Jesus Christ did not inflate himself. He was not conceited. He was willing to serve in the most humble way. God the Father has decreed that he will be recognized and worshiped. God has exalted him, but he never sought to exalt himself. He never sought to exalt himself. And that is an important characteristic. You know, you look through the Bible at servants of God and you find that God's servants didn't try to exalt themselves. There were others. You know, Korah and Dathan and Abiram and some of these, they wanted to get in and they wanted Moses' job. Moses didn't want Moses' job. You know, Moses wasn't out trying to thrust himself forward and to grab all the glory. But his competitors, they wanted his job. They wanted his job. They were conceited. They were puffed up. They were arrogant. 1 Peter Chapter 5. 1 Peter 5 and verse 5, it says, "Likewise, you younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yes, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time." Arrogance repels people. It is a barrier to growth. It is a barrier to growth. You can't learn. You know, conceit and arrogance blocks out being able to learn. It can occur in any number of circumstances. It can occur on the job. It can occur in marriage. It can occur in many contexts where someone has this sort of conceited, I-know-it-all approach, and as a result, they can't learn from somebody else. They can't take a suggestion someone else makes and say, well, you know, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Well, no, I'm in charge. That means I have all the ideas. Well, that's not what it means. When there is an attitude of love, love's not puffed up. Love is not conceited and arrogant, but rather a willingness of all of us to be subject one to another, to be clothed with humility. Realize that God resists the proud. He gives grace to the humble. To humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, and He'll lift us up. You know, God will build us up, not puff us up. Love leads to being built up, not simply being puffed up. So, love is patient, it's kind, it's not envious or jealous. It does not thrust itself forward through boastful bragging. It's not conceited or arrogant, all puffed up. 1 Corinthians Chapter 13 goes on to tell us that love, in verse 5, does not behave itself unseemly. Now, that's an old-fashioned way of saying something. Does not behave itself unseemly. But what it describes is just about as old-fashioned and just about as gone out the door as the expression itself. Because what it has to do with is conduct that is inappropriate, that's rude, that's ill-mannered. You know, it seems like many times people give very little thought to being rude, to being ill-mannered. One translation renders it, love has good manners. Has good manners. Good manners are a way of being courteous, of being polite, not rude. It could be rendered it does not act in a way that is unbecoming. Love shows good manners, which means proper concern, proper courtesy. Let's notice an example back in Genesis chapter 18. Abraham was a man that had good manners. He was an individual that certainly exemplified this aspect of God's nature and character. In Genesis 18, verse 1, we're told the Eternal appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre. Now that sets the stage for the story. We pick it up in the latter part of the verse. Abraham sat in the tent door in the heat of the day, sitting there in the shade. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, three men stood by. Now, when he first saw them, and when he first saw these individuals, the first thing he saw was simply three men. And he ran to meet them from the tent door, and he bowed himself toward the ground. He showed appropriate manners, courtesy. He was very courteous in his greeting to them. And he said, "My Lord," which is not a religious title. It is simply a title of respect. It means sir or mister, as modern English would be the case. "Sir, if I found favor in your sight, pass not away, I pray you, from your servant. Let a little water, I pray, be fetched, and wash your feet, and humble and rest yourselves under the tree. And I'll fetch a morsel of bread, and, come on, sit down, rest." Abraham was a very hospitable individual. He exemplified what certainly epitomized what some of us might have termed Southern hospitality. You don't have to be a Southerner to exemplify hospitality. Abraham was a very hospitable individual. He was the epitome of what we could term Southern hospitality, or the kind of hospitality that really ought to be characteristic. Now, in the society in which Abraham lived, there were not restaurants, there were not motels, there were not things of this sort, and people traveled normally by foot was the most common way, sometimes with animals, and there were needs to be extended, and it was not uncommon to see strangers coming down the road. Abraham looked up and he saw these individuals who were certainly, for all he knew, just men that were traveling between one city and the next. This was a very common way of doing things. This is not, they weren't appearing, as hobos or tramps or somebody that looked like shady characters out to knock you in the head. This is not the context of it at all. And certainly I think we understand that there's appropriate wisdom and discretion to be used. But Abraham looked out, he saw them, he was very hospitable in his greeting, extended his greeting, said, "Come on, please, let me make you welcome, let me make you comfortable. Sit down, let me get something to eat." So Abraham hastened unto the tent, unto Sarah, and he said, verse 6, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, make cakes upon the hearth." Abraham ran unto the herd, and he fetched a calf tender and good, gave it to a young man, and he hasted to dress it. He took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed, and he set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they ate. So Abraham waited on them. He was hospitable. He had good manners. He exemplified that attitude. And in chapter 19, we find in verse 1, "There came 2 angels to Sodom at evening, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground, and he said, 'Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and rise up early, and go on your way.' And they said, 'No, we'll just sleep out here in the street.'" Again, this is not the origin of homelessness here. These were not the original street people, but what is being described was simply that when people traveled through, it was not uncommon. They would come into the city walls at night to be protected from marauders or from people who would be out up to no good. And unless they were extended hospitality, it was common that they would camp out there in the city square just to do that. Again, travel was not as common and as frequent as it is today. We take for granted certain things of travel, and yet some of you remember back, the motels and things that dot our landscape really don't date back that far. Back in the 40s and the 50s, the tourist courts that began to spring up, because as people travel the country, because of the automobile. If you go back in Mr. Armstrong's autobiography, when he traveled from when he traveled out to Oregon back in the 20s, he described stopping and camping along the way. Because that was, as you traveled, you didn't cover a whole lot of miles in one day, and a lot of the places you traveled, you stopped and camped. And this was simply the case. And people would extend hospitality. They would extend good manners in some cases. I remember a story my father told of years ago, which would be, I think, back about 1917, when he and his family made a trip. They were in the process of moving in a team and wagon, distance of about 65 miles. But it was a journey that took them several days there in southern Arkansas. And they stopped along the way at various times, spent the night with relatives one night, and another time they came to an area where they had to ford a stream, had to ford a little creek. They were going to water the horses, and the landowner there invited them not only to water the horses, but he provided feed for them, to let them do that, and invited them to stay there at the night. And wound up, as it turned out, he and my grandfather became good friends, and he wound up hiring him to manage a sawmill. And they just settled right there on his place. But that sort of thing, which has very quickly passed from the scene in the 20th century, the different modes, different customs, in terms of travel, in terms of what is available. But what shouldn't have passed from the scene is the matter of good manners, the matter of hospitality, the matter of being courteous. You see Lot's example, you see Abraham's example even of being courteous in their greetings, and extending proper courtesy and proper concern, not a selfish, indifferent sort of an attitude, but a willingness and a desire to extend hospitality, to be courteous. They were very courteous and mannerly in the way that they addressed these strangers, referred to them in a respectful way. Love has good manners. Whether that applies in the home, in the context of a husband showing courtesy to his wife, and perhaps opening the door for her or holding the chair, whether it extends in terms of teaching our children to be polite and respectful in the way that they respond to their elders, to say yes sir and yes ma'am, Mr. and Miss, to show courtesy, to show respect. They're examples of love. They should be a reflection of an attitude. We live in a society where many of the forms of courtesy are very quickly becoming passé. But the reason the forms of courtesy are becoming passé is because the substance of courtesy the substance which is love, has become passé. More and more, we are a self-oriented society. And as a result, as the substance passes, the form very quickly goes with it, not far behind. Love does not behave itself unseemly. It conducts itself in an appropriate way. It is evidenced by courtesy, by good manners. We're told love does not seek her own, seeks not her own. It's kind of an interesting translation that the French Bible has. It says, the rendering would be literally translated into English, that love doesn't search for her own interest. Love doesn't search for her own interest. Now, that's a pretty descriptive term if you think about it. It means the same, but it's a very descriptive term. Sometimes there are those who are always searching, what's in it for me? Anytime they get involved in anything with anybody, they're on the lookout. What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of it? What's in it for me? It doesn't search for her own interest. Philippians Chapter 2, we were there a few moments ago, but let's notice another aspect of it. Philippians 2:4 said, let this look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. It's not just a matter of looking what's in it for me. Look not every man on his own things, but every man on the things of others. On the things of others. Love does not seek, does not search for its own interest. Love is not selfish, in other words. Love is not self-centered and selfish and searching out for what's in it for me. What am I going to get out of it? Because if it's not to my advantage, if all it's going to do is help you, well, I certainly don't want to do it. What do I get? Continuing on, we're told in 1 Corinthians 13, love is not easily provoked. Is not easily provoked. Now, some translations render it, love isn't easily offended. That's what it means. Love is not quick to be stirred up. Love's not quick to take offense. Some people wear their feelings on the end of their sleeve. It doesn't take much to brush against them. Sort of go around with a chip on their shoulder. And anything that is said or done in any way, they're very quick to read something into it. Oh, I wonder what he meant by that. And they're very, very easily offended. Love is not easily offended. When we really love someone, we're not quick to take offense. We're not quick to try to read in motives and implications and I wonder what's meant. Much of the sort of hypersensitivity that is becoming more and more prevalent in our nation is really a reflection not of love, but of the lack of love that characterizes our society. The fact that people care so little about one another, and they know that it's like everybody goes around, each kind of dividing up into just tinier and tinier little sub-split groups, ready very quickly to take offense that somehow somebody else, everybody's against me. Everybody's against me. And as a result, I'm against everybody else. Love's not that way. Love is not easily offended or provoked. God isn't. You know, Psalm 145, verse 8, we're told the Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger, and of great mercy. See, God's not easily provoked. He's good unto all. His tender mercies are over all his works. He's gracious. He's full of compassion. He's slow to anger, of great mercy. Proverbs chapter 14. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 17. He that is soon angry deals foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. On down in verse 29, we're told, he that is slow to wrath is of great understanding, but he that is hasty of spirit exalts folly. Love doesn't have a hair-trigger temper. Love is not quick to be offended and take offense, read all sorts of things into what people say. I think a remarkable example, an example of what we're talking about was exemplified by a Gentile woman with whom Christ dealt. And I think all of us could learn a lot from her and from her attitude. In Mark chapter 7 and verse 24, we'll read the account here. It's also paralleled in Matthew 15. But in Mark 7:24, Christ and the disciples arose. They went to the borders of Tyre and Sidon, which were Canaanite cities, residue of Canaanite population there on the shore of the Mediterranean, the area of Tyre and Sidon. They entered into a house. This was part of the territory that was ruled by Judea, but it was a sort of an enclave that, while there may have been individual Jews there, it was primarily of foreign population. But they entered into a house and would have no man know it, but he could not be hid. Word got out. He evidently knew someone there, stopped by, was going to spend the night very quietly. A certain woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and she came and fell at his feet. Now, you read earlier in the book of Matthew, you read in Matthew's account that she had earlier created quite a scene by calling to him from a distance, and he had not responded. The disciples had wanted him to send her away, but he just left the situation alone. But she'd created quite a scene out in the street, making, calling to him from a distance. Now she had come in, she fell at his feet. And the woman was a Greek or Gentile, as the term is in the original. She was a Gentile. She was a Syrophoenician by nation. And she besought him that he would cast forth the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said unto her, let the children first be fed. Let the children first be filled. It's not fitting, not meet, to take the children's bread and cast it unto the dogs. And she answered, yes, Lord. Yet the dogs under the table eat of the children's crumbs. She had to come back in a respectful way. And he said unto her, for this saying, go your way. The demon is gone out of your daughter. When she came to the house, she found the demon gone out and her daughter laid upon the bed. Now, the Matthew's account brings out the fact that Jesus had said, I am not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus, in other words, did not come in his first coming to deal with everybody. He came fulfilling certain prophecies of the Old Testament, and his ministry was directed there to the people of his own nation. He came unto his own. He came as a Jew. That was the foundation of the church, and that was where God was starting to work. It was going to extend out, but each in his own order. Here was a woman who had heard of him, and she came, and she wanted him to come and to heal her daughter. And Jesus gave an answer that some would be bothered by, but he simply gave an illustration, an example. She was familiar with it. She was not quick to take offense. She was not easily provoked. Jesus Christ was impressed with her attitude. He was impressed with her attitude. And we're told that it was because of her attitude that he healed her daughter. Even though that was really not why he was there in that locality. He had not come there. That was not where he was conducting his ministry. He had stopped off to spend the night. Didn't really want word to get out that he was there. That was not where he was conducting his ministry. But she had an attitude that certainly exemplifies the very opposite of being easily offended, easily provoked. And her example is highlighted for us. An example of love. Well, we could go on. We're told in 1 Corinthians 13 that love does not keep account of evil. It doesn't keep a list of wrongs. You could look at the example of Joseph and his brothers. You know, they all were afraid when Joseph's father died that Joseph was going to get them now, because they assumed that Joseph had kept account of all the things they had done to him when he was young. And when he got the opportunity, he was going to get even. But you see, Joseph had love. And love doesn't keep an account of evil. It does not maintain a reckoning of evil. It doesn't have a list of mistakes. That's not love. Love is willing to forgive and forget. And if you're not willing to forget, then you haven't forgiven. Because when God forgives, he removes our sin from us. See, love thinks no evil, as it says, or the better. It does not make a reckoning of evil, does not keep an account of evil. Love does not rejoice in lawlessness, it rejoices in the truth. It doesn't delight in scandal. Love bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. Love never fails. The love that God talks about here through the pen of the Apostle Paul is real love. Love that goes into action. Not some substitute, not some false love, not something that is mislabeled, not some sort of pseudo-sensitivity that fractures into 1,000 different little subgroups, each with a chip on its shoulder, ready to dare anyone or anything, ready to take offense at everything from freshmen to manhole covers. That's not what real love is all about. It is characteristic of a society that has become increasingly devoid of love. The real love, the love that is patient and kind, not jealous or envious, not bragging and boastful, not conceited or arrogant. A love that exemplifies good manners, that's not selfish, that's not easily offended or provoked, that doesn't keep some list or tally of how it's been wronged. A love that loves, that believes and hopes for the best. A love that endures. Because it is the love of God that is shed abroad in our hearts through the power of the Holy Spirit. Jesus said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another."